Hello, good morning again, everyone. This is me again, El, and we are about to start with um, our sessions. Um, at this moment, I'd like to formally welcome everyone to DrupalCamp Manila 2020, and I'd like to formally open this by thanking each and everyone who gave their time to make this happen. It has been a real journey to get here as we started planning as early as July 2019, only to find us in a Zoom meeting. Um, I, but I really think that this is what made as a Drupal community, this what makes us truly amazing. Um, it is that we as a community truly adapt always to our times. And I think this is also a reflection for me of how Drupal as an open source application. And I'm very positive about the future of Drupal as a whole. And I'd like to share um, that I personally think the future of Drupal is um, something that we are really to look forward to. And that is why I'm very excited to introduce the person I'm about to. Um, I don't think I'll have enough time to share everything and all the amazing things our next speaker has contributed to Drupal. But what I can say is I am personally admiring, watching, and reading a lot of his work and he has done for the Drupal community, all contributions, all the collaboration work. And that is why I am very excited about our keynote. I'll no longer hold this off. I would like to ask everyone to let us welcome Preston So. There should be a round of applause if, if we were into a room. So I'm gonna switch the hosting privileges to our speaker, and I'll get Preston to share screen and test also audio, and you'll be able to start exactly in a few minutes. Okay, so Preston, hello. I'm gonna stop sharing now, and let's see. And I'm gonna stop video too, so I'll just let everything yours.
Okay, thank you. I'll just do a quick test here.
Loud and clear.
Loud and clear. Good. And let me just test the video here. Is that showing up on your screen?
Yes.
Perfect. I can start in 1 minute since we're not quite at the top of the hour yet. And I'll go ahead and get started here in just a second.
Thank you.
Just going to test my video as well. Can you all see me?
Yeah, that's so refreshing.
Great. Patawad. Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I was here at Jollibee just thinking about what I wanted to get. Wasn't sure if I wanted to get a Chicken Joy or Jolly Spaghetti or Hello Hello. Anyways, is there supposed to be a keynote right now? Is that correct? Oh, okay. I'm very sorry. Very sorry. Let me just get started here. I'm sorry. Jollibee will have to wait, and I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen here. Alrighty, thank you all so much for having me, and I'll start with a small piece in Filipino to start this presentation. Magandang umaga, and kumusta? O talagang magandang gabi dito sa New York. Maligayang pagdating sa DrupalCamp Manila 2020. Ang pangalan ko ay Preston So, at ito ay isang kasiyahan ang narito. Maligayang pagdating sa aking talumpati, isang bagong malaking kompromiso sa pamamahala ng nilalaman. Maraming salamat. At ngayon sa Ingles. Thank you so much for having me. Good morning. Welcome to DrupalCamp Manila. And good evening from New York, where I am currently located. And welcome to DrupalCamp Manila 2020. My name is Preston So, and it's a real pleasure to be here today. And thank you for coming to my talk today called A Grand New Compromise in Content Management. Thank you very much. And just to get started with a few small housekeeping notes, as you can see, if you would like to use the hashtag new grand compromise, you can reach me directly with any questions. Also, my website is preston.so, and I'm also located on Twitter at Preston So. You can also email me, by the way, at preston.so@oracle.com. And I'm here today in New York City, where I am currently working as Senior Director of Product Strategy at Oracle, and also am Editor-in-Chief at Tag1 Consulting. For those of you who might not know much about me, I wrote a book recently, and I know that there's a lot of topics in the sessions here today about decoupled Drupal. So I wanted to share very briefly this book. Actually, one of the things that I'll share as a secret to this group is starting on May 1st, this book will actually be on a discount. So please follow my Twitter if you want to get the discount code to get your very own copy of this book. I also run a conference called Decoupled Days in New York City. And we'd love to welcome you to our first virtual edition this year. Elle just talked a little bit about some of the struggles with DrupalCamp Manila. We have also had struggles with Decoupled Days. I'm so sorry not to be able to join you in person in Manila this year, but we will be hosting our Decoupled Days conference, which is the only conference about decoupled Drupal and the future of headless CMS virtually on Zoom. So decoupleddays.com for information about that. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. What I wanted to cover today was a little bit of a higher level perspective on CMS and where we're kind of moving in terms of our future and the ways in which our kind of CMS industry and our CMS market has been shifting over the course of the last few years. This is really meant to be a really kind of honest look and a frank look at where we are right now in terms of CMS. There's going to be some hard truths in this presentation, but there's also going to be a lot of optimism. And I think that we in the Drupal community, we've been very resilient. We've been very innovative over the course of the past few decades, and we should continue to do all of those things as well. So I'll start with a little bit of discussion about what the history of the CMS looks like right now. I'll talk about briefly the second CMS war, and I'll talk a little bit about how architecturally the separation of concerns in CMSs have been shifting further and further backwards in the stack. I'll also talk about how we can apply certain frameworks to how we think about product strategy for these CMSs, especially some of the more traditional ones that we know of, like Drupal and WordPress. And I'll talk a little bit about this new concept that I've been working on over the course of the past year called the distributed CMS. Or in other words, changing our idea of a content management system over to a content management stack instead. Finally, I want to talk about this kind of what we call a grand new compromise in content management and what exactly that means, and to end with a few notes about Drupal itself. So one of the things that I've done recently on my blog is to write a great deal about what I call the second CMS war. And you're probably thinking to yourself, well, was there even a first CMS war in the first place? Well, there actually was. When you think about Drupal's early history, in the early kind of 2000s, in the mid 2000s, Drupal was really actually a very small player in the CMS market. And today, as a result of a variety of huge contributions that have come from this community, also from here in Manila. I know that yesterday was a huge day for the DrupalCamp as well. And but the thing is that the second CMS war is just around the corner. And one of the things that's been happening, and one of the things that I've been noticing over the course of all of my kind of speaking engagements and talking to people, is that decoupled Drupal is just one symptom of this new CMS war that's coming around the corner. And I know that there are a lot of presentations this weekend about this topic as well. So let's take a look at the CMS market right now. The CMS market is changing very rapidly. We're very familiar with a lot of the major players that we've been working with over the past few decades in PHP, in a variety of different tools that we're using. Drupal, of course, is right in the middle. We have a lot of great innovation happening in Drupal, but there's also great innovation happening in traditional CMSs as well. Folks like Episerver, Adobe Experience Manager, Sitecore, WordPress, not necessarily open source CMSs, but still very important players in the market. We also have my own CMS that I work on, Oracle Content and Experience, or OCE. And for those of you who are wondering, I do still work on open source. I do still work on Drupal, but I also wanted to get my hands dirty a little bit in the Oracle ecosystem. But if you look on the right side of the screen here, there's also a lot of other companies that have emerged in the last couple of years. And I've only taken a subset of those companies and put them on this slide. But if you look at folks like Contentful, Prismic, Forestry, Datto CMS, Sanity, these are CMSs that have really started to get the attention of developers for good reasons, and also for not necessarily the best reasons also. So the CMS market is evolving, and we know that there are these new players out there. Contentful, for example, is a headless CMS that lets you do very rich content modeling, just like Drupal does. Prismic has a very interesting feature that allows you to inject edit buttons into your front-end app if you're using a headless CMS. And also Sanity.io is now taking a very different and interesting approach to how people put together these CMS architectures in the first place. So one of the things I wanted to note is that there's been a lot of interesting change in the developer world. But this has only started to really affect and influence what's going on in the business world and in the marketing world. One of the most interesting things that we can see is that a lot of these analysts that are very popular in terms of choosing who you're going to buy, which vendor you're going to go with in the CMS market, these vendors, these analysts tend to be primarily lagging indicators. They're people who come in after all the innovation has already happened. They tend to not be early adopters. And so if you look at some of these analyst firms like Gartner and Forrester, they're now also waking up and saying, well, there's a bit of an interesting change happening right now in terms of the CMS that we should pay attention to. So recently, Gartner actually retired what's called the Magic Quadrant for web content management. And the Magic Quadrant, for those of you who don't know, is a tool that a lot of buyers will use in various marketing organizations to decide what kind of CMS they want to buy. And as early as late 2018, Forrester, who's another analyst firm, very, very popular as well for people who are choosing vendors, stated just a couple of years ago that the classic era of web content management is at an end. So what does that exactly mean for Drupal, and what does that mean for us? Well, Gartner has a little bit of insight into this. They say that the new phrase of choice, the new way that they're going to talk about our CMS platforms is in the context of what they call DXP, or a digital experience platform. And this is a very interesting phrase because there's a lot of different pieces that make up this phrase. And I want to dive into a little bit of this kind of phrase that we're talking about here. Dean Barker is a friend of mine over at Episerver, and he's got a really interesting quote that was in the Gartner, in the article in CMS Wire about this very topic. And he said that there'll be two sides to DXP. There's going to be content management and experience management. And many of these systems, like Episerver and Drupal, and a lot of other CMSs, like Oracle Content Experience, are going to cover both. But these other systems, like headless CMSs, are only going to be on the content side. I started thinking about this quote, and I thought, well, this is very different from the way that developers think about the DXP and the way that developers think about how headless CMSs will work in this space. And it got me thinking, we're starting to live in two very different realities now. Dean Barker has this perspective of a marketing professional who's in an organization who's choosing a CMS, who has a very particular picture of what a CMS is and does. But now with the headless CMS, we as developers and we as architects have really moved on from this foregoing conception of what a CMS is to really think about more of, well, what's the developer experience like? But is that truly a CMS in the way that our marketing professionals and our marketing teams think about it, and our content teams? What is the CMS? Do we live in two different realities of the CMS now? Is there a schism starting to develop? Those are some of the questions that I want to answer today. But the first thing I want to do is to talk about a little bit of history, because one of the things that I noticed over the past couple of months is actually that the CMS wars, in terms of the first CMS war and the second CMS war that we're about to go into, really reflect actually the browser wars that happened in the past. If you think about the early 2000s with the browser wars back then, Netscape Navigator, Internet Explorer, there's actually a lot of interesting similarities between the browser wars back in those days and the CMS wars that we've been seeing today. And I'll walk through a little bit of that right now. If you remember, in the early 90s, we came out with Mosaic browser. It was the very first browser that was built that had kind of a graphical basis. And one of the most interesting things about the web browser is that obviously it's gone through a lot of change over the years. And if you look at some of the other players at that time after Mosaic, they really kind of started to develop this kind of prerogative to really improve the way in which browsers are not only packaged with other products, but also the features that they offer. If you look at that Mosaic screenshot, you can see that there's a lot of things that aren't really true about the web browser today that were there back then. The grayscale text, for example, and the horizontal rules that have that default styling. And it's a very interesting kind of picture to look at. Well, look at what happened in the late 90s now when we move into the first browser war, where you have these heavyweights. You have Internet Explorer, Netscape Navigator, and there's two reasons why the first browser war was such an important battle in the history of the web. And that is, first and foremost, product packaging. Microsoft had a very good idea that's very similar to the idea that America Online had way back in the day in the early 90s, to send CD-ROMs to every single household in the United States containing an installation of America Online's dial-up service. But the interesting thing about Microsoft in this case is that Microsoft said, we'll do the exact same thing, only we're going to put Internet Explorer on every single installation of Windows that goes out into the wild. And what actually ended up happening was, of course, Internet Explorer won the first browser war. But the other thing that's a little bit less noticed about the first browser war is that there was also this fight towards feature completeness, this idea that you wanted to race to build these new features, these unique features that will really give you a lot of interest in the community of developers that you're trying to reach. And this includes things like the beginnings of CSS, the beginnings of some of the JavaScript that you have started to see in this kind of initial first browser war. But you also see some of the features that we kind of tend to laugh at these days, things like the blink element or the marquee element, which are more cosmetic elements that are now things that are considered not really that useful or really robust for the web. So if you look at Netscape Navigator 2, many of us remember what this looked like from our early days working with the web. And as you can see, it's almost unrecognizable to how we work with the web today. So that was the first browser war. What about the second browser war? Well, the second browser war, of course, we know, ended with Google Chrome dominating pretty much every single country in the world. There are only a couple of countries where Google Chrome is not the dominant browser, and that's actually Opera. Because of their mobile capabilities. But the interesting thing about this is that there were two very different foci for the second browser war. The first was whether or not to leverage open source technology or closed source technology. And this has a direct bearing on some of the open source prerogatives that we have today. One of the very interesting things was that after Netscape lost the first browser war, Netscape decided to open source all of its code that governed its browser, and that actually eventually became Firefox. And for those of us who have worked with Firefox and maybe not have worked with Netscape, it's pretty impressive, this legacy that Firefox has over the years from this really ancient browser that used to exist. But that aside, because we could go into a whole history lesson about that, what's really interesting about the second browser war is the user experience. And one of the things that started to happen in the early days of the second browser war is that you started to have a lot more focus on JavaScript and really being able to serve client-side scripting in a way that was very compelling, not only for developers, but also for the users who are experiencing all of these websites. So the CMS and browser wars are very similar. The first and second browser wars were fought over very similar territory to the first and second CMS wars. There were two categories, two areas that both of these battles focused on. The first was feature completeness, making sure that the feature set was complete and robust and comprehensive. But the second was really around user experience, because the mobile web really introduced a lot of new stressors on browsers. And as we know, over the course of the last few years, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, user experience demands have grown have grown impressively to really demand a lot of change to how we actually build these websites today. So if we compare the first browser war and the first CMS war, they're actually very similar. The feature completeness in browsers that you see in terms of these new features like support for CSS, support for JavaScript, no more of these table-based layouts, really mirrors and reflects the feature completeness that CMSs tried to get to back in the early days. If you remember the prehistory of Drupal, Drupal actually kind of started out as a kind of successor of PHP and some of these message board frameworks, some of these kind of blogging tools that were very simplistic and really didn't have any of the features that we would consider part and parcel to a CMS. Now, what happened was eventually, because people started to realize that they needed to have more and more features, the CMS really exploded in terms of this innovation, especially when it came to the advent of the dynamic server-side integration kind of interactions that we have now today in Drupal. So the first CMS war, for me, really ran from about 2005 to 2014. And this is really where you start to see a lot of the CMSs kind of begin to solidify. You know, Drupal kind of has its ecosystem, WordPress has its ecosystem, and it's very, very solid. If you look at the last kind of 10 years or so, when you think about it, in reality, since about 2013, 2014, these ecosystems haven't really changed that much. They've kind of grown a little bit, but by and large, they've kind of stayed a little bit inertial and haven't really moved in a very compelling direction in any direction. But the really interesting thing about the first CMS war is that it gave us a lot of really impressive things in the CMS. In Drupal, for example, it gave us things like content modeling, CCK, custom query building and views. These same things happen in WordPress as well with advanced custom fields and some of the really impressive query builders that exist out there in other CMSs as well. Now, the really interesting thing about Drupal in the first CMS war is that these features weren't originally part of the first version of Drupal. So if you think about the fact that today we use CCK as kind of our first step into Drupal, to put that content model into Drupal, it's actually a really interesting thing because that didn't exist in the very first iterations of Drupal, and neither did views for that matter either. So these kinds of features are really important. But at the time, we also made some mistakes. Just like with the blink and marquee elements in Netscape Navigator, Drupal also introduced the concept of the color module, which is a really great customization tool for changing the colors around in your theme, but it's not something that's very often used today. And actually, there's really no themes today, at least in the core themes in Drupal, that leverage this kind of approach of the color module anymore. And you can't really set that and configure that anymore. So it's kind of a bit of a dead weight within the Drupal code base. And so, as I just mentioned, it's you know, that color module is in disuse now. And that's how it kind of reflects that this feature completeness went almost a little bit too far. We went too far, we built some stuff that we didn't need, and now we have to pare back. But what about the second CMS war? And this is where things get really interesting. The second CMS war really started from about 2013, 2014, when you really start to see this movement towards headless CMSs. Headless CMSs really began to enter the market around the time of REST APIs becoming really robust and mature, as well as some of the new approaches that we've seen like React, GraphQL, and JavaScript. But the really interesting thing about these architectures is, of course, that there's different flavors, but also the fact that they lend themselves potentially to a better user experience. But the really interesting thing about the difference between the second browser war and the second CMS war in this case, actually, is that the user experience in this case is not really something you can match up between those two periods of time. Because in the second browser war, the user experience is only one person. We're talking about the end user, the person who is going to actually land on that website, go on this, go and log in, do some actions, perform some tasks. But there's only one person who's going to be using your website, and that profile remains pretty much the same across every single profile, every single user who's going to come onto your site. But the CMS has a very different prerogative. The CMS actually has to serve multiple users. And the second CMS war is going to be something that's really won, not based on the end user as we see it in terms of the browser wars, but actually on the milieu of CMS users that exist. It's all of the different personas that we work with on a daily basis. And that means content editors, marketers, we're talking about site builders, developers, but we're also talking about compliance officers, we're talking about product managers, project managers, we're talking about all sorts of people who have to take a look inside the CMS and really collaborate in this single centralized environment. So The second browser war and the imminent second CMS war are really about this fight over how to leverage this new idea of client-side dynamism in a way that actually works for all of the user experiences that we have to provide for. And the browsers only needed to focus on one persona, the end user, but the CMS contends with so many different personas that the CMS is in a really unique position, because there are very seldom any kind of there's very few products like this that have a variety of different personas that we have to serve. If you think about, for example, a typical CRM system, that's generally speaking really the domain of the sales team or the marketing team. There's not really a very different persona involved in working with those systems. Or if you think about an ERP system, or if you think about some of the other systems that we have three-letter abbreviations for, the CMS is really unique because it's really about how to bring all these people together. But there's an interesting other trend going on as well, which is really beginning to challenge the way that we think about content management as well. And it started with the mobile web, but it really ends now with the idea of native mobile applications. And one of the things I always like to say is that over the course of the last 5 to 10 years, we've really started to experience what I call a Cambrian explosion, or a huge growth, a huge proliferation in the kinds of form factors and channels that we have to deliver content to. And this is an incredibly challenging kind of problem for us, because think about all the different experiences now that we have to solve for. It's not just the website. So not only are we contending with a whole different variety of users in the CMS, user personas, be they developers, be they marketers, be they editors, but we're also now grappling with this huge amount of channels that are completely beyond the single use case that we had to consider before, the website. We're now talking about mobile applications that are built with Android and iOS, that are built using Swift or Objective-C or Java. We're talking about set-top boxes like Roku and smart TVs like Samsung TV, Apple TV. They all need a CMS as well. We're talking about wearable technology, Apple Watches, Fitbits that need to have content displayed on their devices as well. We're also talking about things like digital signage. When you go out and you are taking a train or taking a bus, or have to really get this information from screens that are constantly displaying content that may be coming from a CMS and actually should be coming from a CMS. Augmented reality is also a huge concern, virtual reality. Some of these new ideas behind what we call spatial content, and how we actually locate content in space and how we place content in space is a really important consideration that the CMS has never before considered. We've, up until now, talked about how the CMS should place things on a page, but we've never talked about how the CMS should place things in a physical space. By the same token, we've also never talked about how the CMS should place content within the context of a conversation or within the context of a chatbot. So if you think about it, in many ways, the CMS almost evolved a little too early. The CMS is really biased toward the web. It's really biased toward the website. And it really wasn't built originally for any of these other interfaces that are now emerging. And this requires us to really rethink the purpose of the CMS in terms of how the second CMS war is really going to cause us to reevaluate how we think about the CMS at the very base layer. Not as a website builder, not as a content manager for websites, but as a content manager for any conceivable experience that you can think of, well beyond the confines of your regular old website that you visit today. But here's the problem. We have a really big problem today with CMS. And that is that marketers and content editors still want to have control over those non-web experiences. If you're building an AR interface, or if you're building a digital sign, or if you're building a mobile app, that doesn't mean that you can just stop previewing and stop allowing these editors and compliance officers to check whether something's above the fold or whether a headline's wrapping properly. So these content editors and these marketing professionals really need to have that control, the same control they have over the website. They need to be able to bring that over and forklift that over into non-web experiences. And this really illustrates the incongruity of content management today. About 3 years ago, I gave a talk related to this very topic at DrupalCon Vienna called Decoupled Site Building, Drupal's Next Challenge. And really one of the slides that I focused on was kind of this illustration of the fact that when you think about the CMS and all of the different experiences that it has to serve today, there's really only two kinds of experiences that marketers and content editors can really have control over. And kind of, they're actually kind of the same thing, right? We're talking about websites, which are things that you can build visually with site builders within the context of CMSs. But we're also talking about responsive layout design, right? Today with Drupal, today with a lot of different CMSs, you can actually create responsive layouts that are very rich and allow you to have a little bit of flexibility over how your content displays. But what about all of these other channels at the top? What about wearables and chatbots and voice and virtual reality and all these things that now we are seeing more and more people begin to use and work with on a daily basis? Well, that's still the jurisdiction and the purview of developers. And this is not something that any of the marketing teams that we work with or the content teams that we work with have any ability to affect in any capacity. And this is the incongruity that I wanted to highlight today during this conversation. The CMS has always been built fundamentally because of the fact that its legacy is built on these personas that have very, very diametrically opposed needs to one another and very, very different requirements. The CMS has always been built on an uneasy alliance, this kind of uneasy balance and equilibrium between different personas. It's been built fundamentally since the very beginning on compromise. And compromise is something that has characterized the CMS from the very beginning of its existence. But the problem is that with the advent of the headless CMS and with the development of all of these new experiences coming into the marketplace, coming into all the customer experiences that we have to build today, we now know that the problem is today that balance is gone, that equality is gone, that kind of sense of an alliance is gone because not all CMS personas, as you just saw, are treated equal anymore. And this is the fundamental problem facing content management today. And this is what I alluded to earlier when I said that when it comes to headless CMS and traditional CMS, it seems almost like we're living in two different realities. When you look at how a marketer talks about their traditional CMS, and when you look at how a developer talks about their headless CMS, in some ways, the two discourses couldn't be any more different from each other than they are today. In some ways, we've really reached the limit of what the CMS can really do for each of these personas. And that's where we have to really evaluate, well, is the headless CMS or is the decoupled CMS, decoupled Drupal really the right direction? Or is the traditional CMS also really the right direction? That's the question I want to try to answer today. So at DrupalCon Vienna 2017, I showed this graph. And this graph actually generated a lot of commotion in the audience because it's really the first illustration of how these kinds of experiences that are developing in the headless CMS world are actually challenging the very notion of the fact that we also need to serve the end user. The end user at the very end, who's looking at this on their browser or their phone or their tablet or their Alexa interface, is having now to deal with the fact that they're not really sure how some of this content is actually going to get to them. And the fact of the matter is that when you are making something better for developers, is that something that's truly better for everyone else? Now, I recently redid this diagram to demonstrate this a little bit more clearly, to showcase the fact that what really is going on here is that when you look at the combination of all of these experiences that we work with, whether it's a content editor, developer, marketer, this unease, this balance that we've had, this compromise that we've built over the years has really established this kind of solid line that we will never stray from. But the growth in the number of channels has really kind of brought this into stark relief. Now we're seeing that the developer experience is now seeing a lot more privilege and a lot more prestige than the marketer and the editorial experience. But by the same token, we're also seeing an opposite reaction from editors who are saying, okay, you've gone in this direction of headless CMS, you've gone in this direction of building these really interesting developer experiences, but that's too far. That's a step too far. You have to help me now be able to preview, publish, schedule, and see all of my content in context and be able to edit and administer it as well. So this idea of DXP for me is kind of interesting because it really is about this notion of many digital experiences, right? The CMS has always been tied to a website when we think about web content management. But the DXP inherently, intrinsically, is about many different user experiences. But as we've seen, that uneasy balance that I just identified is gone, right? The developers are very happy. Whenever you see somebody who has adopted headless CMS, you can see the smiles on the developer team. But you go across the office and you take a look at the marketing team and they're not very happy. And there's a lot of cases that I've encountered over the last few years, talking with customers all over the world of various CMSs who've encountered this very problem where they said, we've gone in this direction for our developers, but now we've lost all the features that we used to hold dear. These are features that we used to consider non-negotiables. These are features that we used to consider must-have features for our success as an editorial organization. So the problem that we see today is that content has to look different on every channel, right? But the marketers and the content editors who are responsible for how that content should actually get to those channels they have no control over how those channels actually deliver that content and how that content is presented. So my kind of question is, well, is site building as a concept, or if we expand it out to the logical conclusion, is experience building dead as a concept? Because how do you take a really carefully templated, a really carefully laid out page or a kind of microsite and translate that into the mobile context or the smartwatch? What happens when you have a list of related content, or you have a list of embedded nodes within your content entity, and the only way to access those things is by voice? How does Drupal handle that? How do these CMSs handle those kinds of cases? And even more important still, how do the compliance officers check to make sure that pharmaceutical information is correct in the voice interface, just as it is in the website? And by the same token, how do content editors and marketers preview this content before they publish it, because they don't want it to go live right away? And these are all very, very important problems, very, very big problems that's been really challenged by the fact that we have all of these infrastructural needs and all these different hosting providers now. So I'm going to stop here and talk about what I call the holy grail of DXP, of digital experience management. In my opinion, it's what I call presentation management. It's not just about the content, it's about its presentation. And this is not just about merely the ability to actually govern how the content is showing up in the context of, let's say, cards on a smartphone app. It's actually really about how to marry these experiences of all these different personas together in a compelling constellation so that we can rebuild and recalibrate this kind of compromise that we used to have back in the day. And we have to make sure that this relationship between the marketing team and the engineering team remains as frictionless as possible. And in some ways, Drupal really succeeded at that way back in the day, but lately it really hasn't. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is. But this idea of experience management has to restore the balance, this equilibrium that we had before. And the challenge is now to ensure, how do we make sure that these developers who are living in this alternate reality over here with headless CMS, and these marketer teams who are living in the actual reality over here in the traditional CMS, how can we satisfy both of those parties that have very, very different and distinct needs? So I'm going to stop there before I return to that question and talk a little bit about some of the architectural evolution that we're seeing in CMS. One of the things that I asked at a keynote last year I gave in Tokyo was, is the separation of concerns in CMS, this idea of separating data from presentation, content from its aesthetic appearance, the actual makeup of the content model and the content schema from the way that it's cosmetically produced, is that something that's still the case today? The monolithic CMS, or the traditional CMS, has always had kind of an internal sense of a separation of concerns, but it's always been a lot more blurry than a line in the sand. And if you think about it, contextual features that we used to have in Drupal, things like or that we still have in Drupal, things like in-place editing, contextual links, the admin menu at the top, all these in-context tools are really flouting this separation of concerns because they blur that line between data and presentation, this stark separation between those two, this stark schism and bifurcation between these two needs. One of the things that we're seeing today, though, is that there's now rendering happening everywhere. And this data is now being rendered who knows where, whether it's in Gatsby or Vue or Svelte, if you're using Svelte today, or if it's in other channels that we have no control over as developers working on the web. Potentially, we also have this idea of a one-to-one architecture where we have this idea of a traditional CMS that serves content to one single front end. But there's a much more common case that I'm seeing emerge more and more, especially in the enterprise, where you're seeing a one-to-many relationship between a single CMS and these experiences. I can think of a very, very interesting customer of Drupal that I talked to last year, actually. They're using the Drupal front end, but they're also using Angular, and they're also using React, and they're also using a variety of other tools to make a cohesive design system work across a variety of different front-end development tools. So JavaScript-driven rendering is now really encroaching on some of this kind of traditional server-side rendering that the CMS has always governed. And if you think about it, this is what's happening with the separation of concerns. Back in the day, way back when, the separation of concerns was very, very clear, right? It said that no matter what, there's going to be kind of this line between the CMS in terms of the data and the CMS front end. But the problem that we're seeing now with the changes in rendering and the evolution in how things are being rendered is that actually this is no longer the case. We're actually moving down the stack. We're moving further back towards the back end because now we have APIs. Now we have server-side rendering in the form of Node.js in the CMS. And this is something, alongside the CMS. And this is something that is causing a lot of different disruptions within the CMS architectures that we work with today. So now what we're seeing is that whereas the CMS used to have this very clear separation of concerns within its own architecture, now we're seeing in terms of JavaScript a very different picture emerge, where JavaScript is now relying on APIs as their data, but the presentation is fundamentally rooted in its rendering approaches. And this can be extended to a lot of different digital experiences that we deal with now today that are more innovative and more forward-looking and more future-proof. So let's stop there and think about what it is that we need to do to address not only the fact that the separation of concerns has really shifted and evolved over time, but also the fact that we need to reestablish this compromise between all of these user personas. Because how do we help in these situations where marketers feel left behind? I remember a couple of years ago, I spoke with a Drupal user who had just moved off of Drupal 7 website over to a decoupled Drupal site that was serving a React application. And the client was very happy with the performance, very happy with the interactivity, very happy with how the end user experience worked. But the agency that worked on this project got a call a couple months later from the client. And the client said, "Where's my admin toolbar? Where did all my links go? Where did all my menus go where I can administer my content?" And it was only then that that agency realized that, oh no, these are things that we should have really done during discovery and thought about in terms of how we can make sure that our marketing teams also have the ability to use the CMS and work with the CMS and leverage the CMS and leverage this interactivity in the same way that the end users would on the other side. So how do we also help in situations where developers feel behind? Because developers also feel a little bit of concern about how CMSs work. And this is where I want to illustrate a bit of a bifurcation that's happening in the CMS market, a kind of temporary schism where we're seeing a little bit of that kind of gap in the middle between these two approaches. The headless CMS has really gone in the direction of extremely high developer manipulability. So developers can do anything they want with headless CMS, but really low marketer manipulability, which means that you as a marketer or content editor have a lot of trouble working with headless CMS. But by the same token, the kind of traditional CMS has also gone in this new direction where we're seeing that the developer now is complaining about Twig. They're complaining about PHP template. They're complaining about some of these, what they consider antiquated, anachronistic, archaic approaches to theming and templating within these CMSs that really shouldn't be the way that they want to work in the first place. That's why they're moving over to JavaScript and leveraging decoupled CMS architectures. But as you can see, in the very middle here, we have that historic web-only or traditional CMS. And that's where that grand compromise that I mentioned earlier was. That really uneasy, but actually stable balance, that kind of inertia or entropy that we found with the ability for the CMS to serve all of these different users in an equal way. So marketing functions in enterprise actually still hold the purse strings for CMS, which means that it's not the engineering teams still that are buying these CMSs. It's the marketing teams that are buying them. And so if you can't convince your marketing team lead or you can't convince your CMO that this is an important concern for them, you're not going to win any kind of deals with these actual buyers. So marketing teams are still the fundamental key to the dungeon. So let's talk a little bit also about some of the issues behind the marketer's experience. There's also a little bit to be said about the fact that just as developer experiences have gone way too far in the direction of headless CMS and only allowing developers to manipulate these things, back in the day, marketers actually had this problem too. If you think back to those tools like FrontPage, Dreamweaver, some of these really popular WYSIWYG tools to build websites, they were great for marketers, and content editors and marketers loved them because they said, finally, I don't have to call my webmaster and ask them to make these changes. I can do it all myself with a really nice visual builder. There was just one problem with this, right? Or two, actually. The developer looked at the code that was generated by FrontPage or Dreamweaver and said, no, I am not going to touch this with a 10-foot pole. But the second problem as well was that once you started to get DHTML and client-side scripting and JavaScript emerging into the picture, suddenly the marketer is completely unable to do anything with some of these interactions and some of these really nice user interfaces that they want to build in the first place. What that means is that the advent of web programming actually spelled the end for WYSIWYG. And so we had to kind of drag the marketers back and say, hey, marketers, WYSIWYG isn't the right approach anymore. We'll give you a layout builder. We'll give you a preview tool. We'll give you all these cool things, but you're not going to do WYSIWYG anymore because that's not really going to be something that's going to fly. So we have to do the same thing for developers. We have to pull them back and say, look, you've gone a little bit too far in this direction. We love what you're doing, but you have to think about some of these users who are saying, hey, the CMS is not really what it is anymore for me, and I'm not really getting as much value as I was able to get from it before. So the new CMS taxonomy is very interesting because headless CMSs have always been in this direction where the marketers are always saying, hey, I've lost my visual site building, but I need something. You got to give me preview at least. You got to give me some kind of bare minimum, bare metal kind of thing that I can use. And the same thing for developers. Developers are saying, well, hey, you got to work with us a little bit. You got to give us WYSIWYG back. You got to give us all of that back so that we can actually have the control that we need over the code. So it's actual good, robust code. And we'll work with you on finding what we can do for you. But this is the problem. That's not going to work long term, because these two different personas have to be able to come together in a way that meets in the middle and reestablishes this very compelling middle ground. So tight coupling is no longer the answer for CMS architectures. As I said earlier, the CMS might have evolved a little too early because it's so tightly coupled to the idea of a website and so biased toward the web that it's not really something that should have involved the web in the first place. So the question for Drupal and the question for CMSs everywhere is, well, should the CMS just be the headless CMS and go in that direction of just being a content repository that remains framework agnostic and is just a content store? Well, that's going to spell the end for Drupal because there's a lot of really great content repositories out there that have key value stores or have structured content, but Drupal does so much more than that. And that's really kind of at the core of what Drupal has done so well and why it's found such success over the last 2 decades, is the fact that it's actually crafted that amazing compromise and that balance between all of these different personas. So that's what I actually argue. I actually believe that the CMS is not a content repository. The CMS is not destined to be headless in terms of really focused on the developer experience. The CMS is a conjunct of workflows that both editors and developers can use to gravitate and orbit around this happy medium, this uneasy balance, this grand compromise. So we know that marketers are very fickle. And as I just demonstrated just now, right, marketers, they can live without WYSIWYG, but they can't live without preview. Just as developers can live without certain things, but they can't live without certain things. There's always a spectrum and there's always a range of what these users want and what these users actually need. And that's the thing that we have to really help educate some of these users about. Marketers and content editors have to rightfully understand that they're not going to be able to have access to some of these contextual features like in-place editing or layout management when you're talking about a smartwatch or you're talking about a smart TV. That's just out of the box. It's just not going to work. So we have to really kind of go in this different direction. And there's a thinker who can help us with this. Abraham Maslow was a pioneer and a leading thinker in the realm of motivational psychology. And in 1943, he published this really important paper that summarizes what he calls the hierarchy of needs. Maslow aimed to get to a point where he could identify the pyramid of needs, starting from the very bottom, the very basal need that all humans have, all the way up to the top, the least kind of needful thing or the least necessary thing that humans need, but that humans want. Now, one note I want to make here is that Maslow was very influential, not only in motivational psychology, but also in various other fields, including things like anthropology and a variety of other fields. But there's also a little bit of datedness to his thinking. And if you look at some of his work, it's a little bit in the past. And so I want to preface this by saying that a lot of his ideas are a little bit centered around some outdated ideals and some outdated philosophies, but it's still a very compelling framework for us to think about from the context of how we can strategize about reestablishing this grand compromise. Now, the hierarchy of needs under Maslow's conception really starts with what we call a physiological need, right? Which means we need to be not in pain. We need to be healthy. We need to not be sick. And then it goes into safety. We need shelter. We need to have food and water. And then it goes up and up and up and up to love and belonging. We need a romantic partner. We might need somebody, a friend to talk to, some family. And it ends with what he calls self-actualization, which means basically all of these needs are now covered by what I've already got. And I'm going to do what I always wanted to do, which is something that I've never been able to do before because all my other needs are covered. So now I can focus on wants and not needs. Now, this hierarchy of needs is something that we can actually apply to these personas in the CMS as well. So if you think about the developer audience of the CMS and their hierarchy of needs, let's consider, for example, Drupal's REST API that now governs a variety of different headless applications that are now being built in Manila and also around the world. There's certain needs that fall into a spectrum that all of these developers have. And by the same token, needs that marketers have as well that fall into this kind of spectrum as well. So one of the things I wanted to talk about briefly also was the fact that there's always going to be a minimum threshold. Once you reach that minimum point, that user is going to be happy. So think about the marketer, for example, who says, well, okay, I don't really need WYSIWYG. I don't need to be able to control every single pixel on a website, but I do need some kind of a layout manager, or I do need some kind of a preview system to be able to see my stuff in context. That's the kind of gauging and the kind of calibration that we're going to have to do. Because the fact of the matter is that our previous hierarchy of needs for marketers was completely ill-suited to how digital experiences work today. Now, one of the things I wanted to bring into here also is this concept of what's called stratigraphy. One of the things I was always a fan of when I was a kid, I always wanted to become a field geologist. And field geologists have the privilege of being able to travel around the world, looking at rock formations, looking at different terrain, and really identifying how this terrain came to be, how these layers of sedimentary rock came to form themselves in this way. And stratigraphy is really the study of strata, layers, and also stratification, how those layers actually materialized. One of the things that's very interesting about the more modern kind of idealizations of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is that actually most of the people who have studied Maslow's hierarchy of needs over the last couple of decades have said, you know, it's not really a pyramid, and it's not really a spectrum or a pyramid that stays solid. Sometimes these tiers might reverse or flip over, or they might kind of get slanted, or they might be completely overturned. And if you think about the way that plate tectonics work and the way that continental drift happens and all of these earthquakes and the ways in which our geology works on our planet, it's very similar. And if you think about it, the same exact thing is happening to our hierarchies of needs as well. Do marketers really still need true WYSIWYG? Do marketers really still need layout management? Have other considerations come up to the top? Has the stratification reversed? Has this kind of collection of layers actually gone into reverse or slanted or gone into a different kind of idea of how it should look? There's a lot of different ways to really approach the hierarchy of needs from this kind of perspective, especially when you bring in the idea of the more modern approach to hierarchies of needs, which is that, you know, these things change all the time. These layers are constantly moving and the lines between them are constantly in flux as well. And there's often a lot of disruption as well in the picture too. So one of the things that we have to do is to find where that strata, that stratum, that particular kind of compromise is, that particular kind of cross cleavage that we can say is something that works for both marketers and developers, something that works for all of our users across the board. And if you think about it, there's different ways that we can actually think about this. And this is not the only one by any means, and this is just hypotheticals, but it is kind of the thinking that we have to really start to embark on to really determine what exactly the minimum viable CMS is going to look like of the future. Now, there's a lot of people who are working on this very problem right now, who are scaling this hierarchy of needs, scaling this mountain and going up these different sedimentary layers and encountering new layers. And if you look at some of the headless CMSs out there right now, and some of the headless CMS products that are out there right now, there's a lot of interesting work going on, and I highly encourage you to check out my blog for more information about those. So what I wanted to do is to actually talk a little bit about some of the ways in which our CMS architecture is going to have to evolve. And one of those is through distributed CMS. But because I'm running out of time here, and because I've given this material before in a previous talk, I'd like to encourage all of you to actually check out the content that I've written about this in my blog, in favor of me going to the more important conclusions that I wanted to land on about this very topic. And I think that's going to be more salient for a lot of our thinking and a lot of this audience as well, from the standpoint of exactly how we want the CMS to work for all of these new audiences. Now, the thing is that we know that the content management system is no longer a single system. It's a stack. And this is something I've talked about in Pune, in India last year, as well as in my blog. So what happens, though, when these marketing teams and these editorial teams are subjected to this intensifying feature loss, this worsening kind of subjugation of their requirements? There's no real easy answers to this problem. But what we need is a grand compromise. And it needs to be a new grand compromise to replace the old one that we had back in the late 2000s and early 2010s. In the United States, the word great compromise or phrase grand compromise has a lot of different connotations. And one of those is from US history. Back in the 1780s, when the Constitution was being written by the early colonists and kind of political philosophers of the United States, they had a constitutional convention where they decided to settle the question of how the new United States would be represented in the Congress of the United States. And there's a lot of historical precedent to this idea of grand compromises making a lot of things possible. For example, our bicameral legislature in the United States is a direct result of the fact that they decided that smaller states with lesser populations would have equal representation with larger states in the Senate, whereas states that had more population would actually have more proportional representation in the House of Representatives. And this is the exact kind of grand compromise that we need within the CMS. We need to enable some of these non-negotiable marketing needs. We can't just tell a marketer that because we've gone over to the headless CMS or decoupled Drupal, that they suddenly don't have access to preview or some of the features that they hold dear to their heart. And we're not in a post-content era. A lot of kind of thought leaders in the CMS industry lately have said, we're in a post-CMS world now. There's these static site generators, there's JavaScript frameworks. We're not in the CMS world anymore. But that's a really kind of a misnomer, because in their mind, they're thinking about content as data. But we're not living in a post-content world where the content is just data, because marketers fundamentally still think about content as content. And content is necessarily presented in the context of the CMS. And we know that this is a problem. So neither of these two new kinds of CMSs, or the old kind of CMS, neither of these two CMSs are really equipped for the market that we face today. We need something different. We need a new grand compromise. We need something that really forges that equilibrium and that uneasy alliance that we had in the late 2000s and early 2010s. Excuse the typo there. Marketers and developers, they don't work in isolation, no pun intended. And this level of constant collaboration and this ability to have marketers and developers compromise to a degree for a very favorable outcome aligned together is something that is unique to the CMS. And that's something that we should restore to the CMS. I don't believe that headless CMSs can solve every single problem that we face today. And our new grand compromise that we need to forge in the Drupal community has to involve novel workflows, new approaches, new paradigms, new architectures, new infrastructure potentially as well, to encompass all the different needs that we are going to have to consider in the future, and all the different ways and the strata that marketers consider to be part and parcel and crucial and essential to their hierarchy of needs. So what does this mean for Drupal in this context? Well, in Drupal's early days, the developers and marketers came together to a middle ground, as I just mentioned. And we can repair that schism, that bifurcation, that separation, by focusing on how we enable both to succeed. How do we consider their needs to be equal? And how do we move them forward in a way that advances both of their needs and both of their outcomes in a way that makes a compelling user experience for the person that matters the most, the end user? So Drupal's next challenge is not only to restore the equilibrium, but it's also to regain that level of success it had with that equilibrium in the early first half of Drupal's great and long and storied history. And with that, I want to end here with some resources for you. If you'd like to check out some of these blog posts that I've written, contains a lot more information and color about some of the things that I've discussed here. And thank you very much. Maraming salamat. Thank you.
Thank you, Preston.
Thank you very much, Preston. This is such an amazing keynote. Um, so supposedly can still have a number of questions. I have one question already here. Um, so Preston, as someone who is new to CMSs, what advice can you give to become ready to this next war and to be prepared to this next new grand compromise that we're thinking?
That's a great question, Al. Yeah, for people who are new to CMSs, obviously, I imagine some of this might have gone a little bit over your head. For those of you who are new to CMSs, though, I invite you to challenge some of the people that you're talking to. One of the things that I find with CMS is that these days, a lot of times we kind of sweep a lot of things under the rug. And a lot of marketing collateral that you find that talks about CMSs today, especially headless CMSs, is very breathless and very excited and very animated about the possibilities. But I would encourage you to look beyond the marketing pitches and look beyond some of the kind of viral marketing that a lot of these products are doing to look at, okay, how are they actually serving not just the developer, but also some of the other users that are in the picture? Now, in terms of how to prepare for this second CMS war, I would pay I would start to focus very closely on a lot of the CMSs that are doing very interesting things with how do we bridge this gap? Because Drupal is doing some very interesting things in this regard too. If you look at the fact that now there are a lot of implementations that are using what's called the paragraphs module, which allows you to order kind of content arbitrarily on a page, or that are using really interesting new ways to leverage how the CMS works. These are things that will really influence how the CMS continues to work from now on. So if you're just getting into Drupal, get involved in Drupal. Drupal is a great place to be. As I said, Drupal is really the paragon of a lot of the things that I mentioned in this talk. Drupal is doing a lot of things right and has always done a lot of things right. And now it has to continue to do those things right. So I would continue to follow along with Drupal, join the Manila community. They're a friendly bunch, everyone that I've met, of course. And, the key here is going to be how exactly do we kind of think about moving Drupal forward in a way that is going to make sure that it survives for many different people and many years into the future. That being said, I don't know if I answered your question in a very concrete way, but I hope I gave some color to your thoughts there.
Thank you, Preston. There's one more question here that we'd like to ask. So for the Drupal community, do you think we have the right initiatives in place in order to achieve and get through to this next war or to reach the grand compromise?
It's a great question. I would say that yes and no. Yes and no. So Drupal has a number of amazing initiatives that are doing a number of really great things. And there's always going to be certain initiatives that are fundamental to the very foundation and underpinnings of Drupal and are essential to the way that Drupal works. So the first that I'm thinking of right now is the admin UI initiative, for example. They're building out all of these really amazing new administrative interfaces in Drupal that are allowing for this kind of centralized place of editing and collaboration to be very rich and interactive in a way that it wasn't before. The second, of course, is the API First initiative, which is underlying and undergirding a lot of this work to enable experiences to work beyond the web with Drupal. But I think there's still a big gap in terms of, okay, so now that we've got these great kind of features in the APIs, we've got great developer experiences in place, how do we now bridge that gap between the developer and the marketer when it comes to voice or when it comes to chatbots or when it comes to augmented reality or digital signage? That's where I see a very big opportunity for an initiative here that starts to go in that direction. And to be honest, I'm a little bit worried about some of the ways in which Drupal really went very far in this direction about 5 years ago, where they said, we're going to do all sorts of really cool things to enable these very rich experiences. But if you look at Acquia for the last couple of years, they've kind of retreated from that and said, well, we're going to focus on the website use case. And really, they've just acquired a layout builder for websites. And it shows that potentially their focus is on the website audience and not on some of these other kind of experiences. And I think that's a very dangerous route to go down, because these digital experiences are going to become just as important as the website in just a matter of a couple years. And if we're not ready for that as a Drupal community, then we don't really stand a chance in this new world. And we're going to lose the second CMS war, even though we won the first CMS war. We'll be the Internet Explorer to today's Google Chrome.